REID arrives at the desolate lighthouse, a symbol of his new, isolated life and a desperate attempt to outrun his grief. The vehicle groaned, its tires spitting gravel as REID navigated the final steep ascent. Above him, the sky pressed down, a canvas of bruised gray that mirrored the churning sea far below. He had been driving for days, the landscape gradually shedding any trace of civilization. The last town, a cluster of wind-battered structures huddled against a bluff, now felt a lifetime away. This journey, a deliberate act of severance, had led him through a desolate mountain pass, its jagged peaks clawing at the low clouds, the air growing colder, thinner, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The road, a ribbon of cracked asphalt, had narrowed to a single lane of compacted dirt, winding like a forgotten scar across the unforgiving terrain. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, a dull ache behind his eyes, a constant reminder of the reason for his flight. Grief, a heavy, suffocating shroud, had clung to him for months, a relentless companion he hoped to finally outrun in this remote corner of the world. Then, through a sudden break in the swirling mist, it appeared. It stood stark against the horizon, a solitary sentinel of salt-worn stone, its conical cap a faded, peeling red. It was taller than he had imagined, gaunt and imposing, perched precariously on a craggy promontory that jutted into the furious ocean. The structure looked less like a beacon of hope and more like a monument to endurance, or perhaps isolation. Rust streaked down its sides from unseen metal fixtures, and the glass of the lantern room, though intact, appeared clouded as if weeping. He parked the vehicle on a patch of uneven ground, the engine dying with a final shudder. He stepped out, his boots crunching on loose shale. The air here felt different, heavier, laden with an invisible presence that prickled his skin. He told himself it was just the sea air, the unfamiliarity of the place. A thick, rusty padlock hung from a hasp, a relic of a bygone era. He pushed the door inward. It moved with a groan that resonated deep within the structure, a sound like an ancient sigh. Motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy windows. The ground floor was a single circular room, sparsely furnished with a heavy wooden table and 2 chairs, all caked in a fine layer of gray dust. A narrow, winding staircase, its cast-iron treads worn smooth in places, spiraled upwards into the gloom. He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on a small, built-in desk tucked into an alcove. It was simpler than the table, clearly a functional space for a keeper. A single drawer, stiff with disuse, resisted his pull for a moment before yielding with a grating scrape. Inside, beneath a thin layer of dust and a few stray, rusty nails, lay a small, leather-bound book. No title adorned its front. It was clearly a journal. He picked it up, the unexpected weight of it unsettling. The pages were yellowed, brittle, and filled with a tight, looping script in faded ink. The handwriting was precise, almost obsessive. The first entry was dated nearly a century ago. He didn't read the words, not yet. He imagined the keeper, hunched over this very desk, pen scratching in the lonely hours, the roar of the sea his only companion. This place, he realized, was not empty. He tucked the journal under his arm, a strange sense of unease settling over him. He had sought solitude, a blank slate, but the lighthouse, it seemed, already had its own story, and he was now part of it. Its stark silhouette seemed to absorb the last vestiges of light. Unpacking was a methodical, exhausting task. Each box carried into the cavernous, damp interior of the lighthouse felt heavier than the last. The air inside was thick with the scent of salt, decay, and undisturbed dust, a smell that clung to his clothes and hair. Floorboards groaned under his weight, a constant low complaint. The wind, a relentless presence, whistled through ill-fitting window frames and rattled the thick, grimy panes, creating a symphony of sighs and moans that REID initially dismissed as the natural voice of an ancient, exposed structure. On the second evening, as he attempted to assemble a makeshift bed frame in the keeper's quarters, a distinct thump echoed from the floor above. It was heavy, singular, and unlike the rhythmic creaks of the house. REID paused, a wrench suspended in his hand. The sound had been precise, as if something substantial had been dropped. He waited, listening, but only the wind's mournful keen answered. He rationalized it as a loose shutter, perhaps a seabird striking the glass of the lantern room. He resumed tightening the bolts, his movements slightly less fluid. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting gray of the sky and the relentless roar of the ocean. REID established a routine, unpacking, making small repairs, attempting to bring a semblance of order to the neglected space. He found himself layering clothing, a scarf perpetually wrapped around his neck. The sounds, however, persisted and subtly intensified. A soft scratching would sometimes emanate from behind the wainscoting in the main living area, faint but insistent, like claws on wood. He'd tap the wall and it would cease, only to resume minutes later from a different section. At first, he attributed them to the wind, mistaking the rush of air through a crack for indistinct voices. But sometimes, when the wind momentarily died down, a faint, breathy murmur seemed to linger just at the threshold of hearing. He'd stop, strain his ears, and the sound would vanish, leaving him with only the dull throb of his own pulse. He'd shake his head, attributing it to fatigue, the echoes of his own thoughts in the vast emptiness. Grief, he knew, could play cruel tricks on the mind. He would pivot sharply, his gaze sweeping the space, but there would be nothing. Only the static, heavy air. He snapped his head up, his eyes darting, but the wall was bare, illuminated only by the lantern's yellow glow. He would pause, mid-step, his hand hovering over a doorknob, and slowly turn, scanning the empty spaces. The feeling was most acute when he was alone in the lower levels, the heavy stone walls seeming to absorb all sound, leaving him exposed. He found himself checking locks more frequently, pulling curtains tight even in daylight. He would walk into a room and feel an immediate, unsettling awareness, as if he had just interrupted something, or someone, who had been there moments before. The isolation he had so desperately sought was beginning to curdle, transforming into something suffocating. He tried to dismiss it all as the tricks of an old house, the creaks and groans of a century of existence. But the feeling of being observed, constant and unwavering, was becoming harder to explain away, harder to rationalize as merely the product of his own troubled thoughts. The lighthouse, he realized, was not merely a structure. It was a presence, and it was beginning to assert itself. A gust of wind, laden with salt and the raw scent of the sea, rattled the window pane. He exited the truck, the crunch of gravel under his boots a sharp punctuation mark in the quiet. The place he had chosen, or perhaps the place that had chosen him. He retrieved his duffel bag from the truck bed, the weight familiar in his grip. The air here was different, sharper, carrying a faint metallic tang beneath the brine. He walked towards the squat keeper's cottage attached to the tower's base, the flagstones uneven beneath his feet, slick with sea spray. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of damp stone, mildew, and something else. A faint, acrid scent he could not quite place. Motes swirled in the beam, thick as fog. The cottage was sparse. A cot, a rough-hewn table, a single chair, all coated in a uniform layer of fine gray dust. He ran a finger along the table's surface, leaving a clean streak in the grime. His determination, a steady undercurrent since the journey began, did not waver. This was simply a task, a new beginning. He moved through the small living space, his footsteps echoing softly. A narrow doorway led into the base of the lighthouse tower itself, He didn't climb it yet. His attention was drawn to a small, built-in cupboard beneath the stairs, its wooden door slightly ajar. A faint, almost imperceptible draft emanated from within. He knelt, pulling the door fully open. Inside, nestled among a few forgotten tools, a rusty wrench, a coil of stiff rope, was a leather-bound book. Its cover was scuffed and worn, the leather cracked along the spine, and the pages within seemed to ripple, swollen by years of damp. It looked less like a logbook and more like an artifact. The volume felt heavy, substantial, its weight disproportionate to its size. The musty scent of aged paper and something faintly metallic, like old blood or rust, rose from its pages. He carried the book to the table, clearing a space with his arm. The bulb above hummed, its light weak but sufficient. The first few pages were filled with neat, precise script, dated entries detailing weather conditions, supply deliveries, and routine maintenance. The handwriting was firm, legible, belonging to a previous keeper named Elias Thorne, as indicated by an initial entry. Lantern operating at full efficiency. No vessels sighted. October 15th, 1903. Strong southerly gale throughout the night. Fog rolled in thick at dawn. Heard a distinct tapping against the lantern room glass, though no seabirds were visible. Dismissed it as wind-borne debris. The script, while still clear, seemed to carry a faint tremor. It is rhythmic, almost insistent. He noted the increasing frequency of these observations. The entries became shorter, less focused on official duties, more on personal observations. It dims sometimes, then brightens, without his intervention. He have checked it repeatedly. The sounds are constant now. It comes from the walls, from the very stone. REID see it at the periphery. The clinical detachment he usually maintained was eroding. He could almost hear the keeper's voice, a man pushed to the edge. He feel its breath, though no breath stirs the air. It is not on the glass. It is inside the lantern room, a fingernail on the metal housing. The light is his only solace, but it flickers more often now. It drains the light. The words grew more frantic, sprawling across the page. Some entries were just fragmented sentences, almost illegible. No, not draining the light. The light is weaker, but it is there. And the thing, it grows stronger. Its form is clearer now, a towering silhouette against the glass. In the water. REID's breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a moment, the image of a towering silhouette against the lantern glass burning behind his eyelids. He reopened them, forcing himself to continue. The sounds. They are pleading. The keeper before him. He knew. The sea takes, but it gives back what it wants to keep. The final entry, dated December 8th, was barely legible, a series of scrawled lines and desperate overlapping words. It is coming for the light. The door. It is no longer locked. They sing for him. The page ended abruptly, the ink smeared, as if the pen had been dropped mid-sentence. There were no more entries. The hum of the single bulb above seemed to pulse, its light momentarily dimming, then regaining its faint glow. He had not been alone. And now, he wondered, neither was he. He traced the faded ink with a fingertip, a shiver rising from his spine. The words had spoken of a presence, of the sea claiming its own, of a final, desperate act. His own solitude, which he had so carefully curated, felt suddenly thin, permeable. That night, sleep offered no refuge. He was not merely dreaming. He was transported. The air around him was bitter with brine and the metallic tang of old blood. He stood on a narrow ledge, the wind of physical assault tearing at his clothes. Below, the sea churned, a ravenous maw of white foam and black depths. The light of a beacon cut through the gloom, not the steady beam of his own lighthouse, but a frantic, desperate pulse, barely visible through the torrential rain. The man's cry was ripped from his throat by the gale, a sound of profound despair that echoed in Reed's own chest. He woke with a gasp, his sheets tangled, his skin slick with sweat. The wind outside howled, a familiar sound, yet now it carried the faint, lingering echo of that lost cry. He spent the morning in a fog, the memory of the dream clouding his movements. They came not just in sleep, but in the liminal spaces between waking and consciousness. He would drift off in his armchair, the old journal still clutched in his hand, and find himself standing on a desolate shore. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and ancient. He saw the lighthouse, not as it was now, but newer, its stone sharp-edged, its lamp unblemished. He could never quite make out their faces, but their posture spoke of an enduring burden, a silent vigil. One afternoon, he decided to drive into the nearest town, a 15-mile journey along the coastal road, hoping the change of scenery would dislodge the persistent unease. As his vehicle climbed away from the shore, the road narrowed, twisting inland. He found himself ascending a winding mountain pass, the asphalt giving way to gravel, and then a treacherous dirt track. Above, jagged peaks scraped the bruised sky. It was an arduous, desolate route, one he hadn't fully registered on his initial drive-in. Then, the vision seized him with terrifying clarity. He was no longer in his car. He was on foot, the same biting wind tearing at his threadbare coat, a heavy canvas bag slung over his shoulder, its contents clanking with glass and metal. The ground beneath his worn boots was slick with mud and loose scree. He could feel the ache in his calves, the burning in his lungs. This was the same mountain pass, but it was older, wilder, untamed. He saw the path ahead, barely more than a goat trail, winding precariously along a sheer drop. The sky was bruised purple, heavy with unspoken storm. He was a keeper, a long-ago keeper, making the arduous journey to the lighthouse. The isolation was a tangible thing, a cloak of loneliness woven into the very fabric of the landscape. The lighthouse, a distant, fragile needle against the churning gray horizon, seemed to beckon, but also to judge. He slammed on the brakes, the tires spitting gravel. He was still in his car, his hands still on the wheel, the smell of burnt clutch filling the cabin. The mountain pass was real, the winding road before him solid. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible outline of a barely used track veering off the main road, just as it had in his vision. He had been on this road before, but never had he perceived it with such stark, historical detail. Never had he felt the very stones beneath him vibrate with the footsteps of another. He turned the car around. The desire to reach town evaporated, replaced by a desperate need to understand. The blurring of past and present was becoming unbearable. He found himself questioning the solidity of his own hands, the reality of the vehicle around him. Was he truly Reed, a man seeking solace, or was he merely a vessel, a consciousness adrift in the echoes of the lighthouse's forgotten souls? It was reaching into his mind, showing him glimpses, perhaps even memories that were not his own. The solitude he had sought was dissolving, replaced by a terrifying intimacy with a history he was unwillingly forced to relive. The final entry of the logbook still resonated in his mind, a discordant note. He sat at the heavy oak table, the leather-bound volume spread open beneath the single stark bulb. A specific alignment of stars, a mention of the high path, and a crude sketch of a jagged peak against a moonless sky. Reed's gaze drifted from the journal to the window, where the last vestiges of daylight bled from the horizon, painting the churning sea in bruised purples and bruised grays. The wind, a constant companion, moaned around the lighthouse lantern room, a low, sustained lament. The entries were fragmented, almost poetic in their despair, but within the rambling, he perceived a pattern. The previous keeper had not been merely documenting weather. He had been charting a course, or perhaps a memory. He reread the phrase, "The sentinel watches from the high path, where the wind bites deepest and the gulls cry a forgotten name." The high path had always been a loose term for the rugged, ascending trail that snaked behind the lighthouse, away from the immediate shoreline. It was less a path and more a series of precarious ledges and crumbling rock faces, a natural barrier between the lighthouse and the desolate moorland beyond. He had avoided it, drawn instead to the immediate crashing expanse of the ocean. With a resolve born of his growing unease, REID pushed himself from the table. He grabbed a heavy-duty lantern and a small trowel, the practical tools a stark contrast to the unsettling task ahead. He began his ascent, the beam of his lantern cutting a wavering swathe through the deepening twilight. The path narrowed quickly, forcing him to place each foot with care. Loose scree shifted under his boots, a faint scraping sound lost beneath the relentless shriek of the wind. This was the mountain pass of the logbook, he realized. Not a grand, traversing route, but a harsh, unforgiving ascent, an exposed spine of rock overlooking the turbulent sea. Higher up, the wind intensified, tearing at his clothes, plucking at his hair. The gulls, true to the logbook's description, wheeled overhead, their cries echoing raw and mournful. The logbook's sketch, crude as it was, had depicted a distinct, almost unnatural depression in the rock, shielded by a low overhang. He squinted, his breath fogging in the frigid air. It was too regular to be natural, camouflaged by years of wind-blown debris and clinging moss. He knelt, scraping away the layers of grit and dried lichen with the trowel. Beneath, a roughly cut stone slab, no larger than his palm, sat wedged into the opening. It took considerable effort to dislodge it, the stone resisting with the tenacity of a forgotten secret. It carried a faint, almost metallic scent, mingled with something else, something organic, long decayed, and faintly sweet, like old pressed flowers. He shone his lantern into the cavity. It was small, perhaps a foot deep, lined with what appeared to be tightly woven coarse burlap. He carefully extracted the items. The first was a locket, tarnished and dull, its silver almost black with age. It was small, delicate, clearly designed for a child, etched with a faint, barely discernible image of a tiny anchor. Inside, 2 faded sepia-toned photographs. A young woman with kind, tired eyes, and a small, solemn-faced girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, clutching a doll. Both stared out from the past, their gazes unsettlingly direct. Beneath the locket, nestled in the burlap, was a small, desiccated sprig of heather, its tiny purple flowers shriveled to brittle husks. And then, a final item. A single, small, hand-carved wooden bird, its wings broken, its surface smoothed by countless touches. It was a child's toy, worn and loved. REID stared at the objects, the locket heavy in his palm, the wooden bird a ghost of play. The air seemed to thicken around him. The forgotten tragedy. The words echoed in his mind, now given a terrible, specific form. Not a storm, not a shipwreck, but a loss, intimate and profound. A child lost to the sea, or perhaps to something else, something tethered to this desolate place. The sentinel, the high path, the gulls crying a forgotten name. The keeper had not just lost a child. He had buried a piece of his heart in this hidden crevice. A desperate attempt to keep a memory safe from the malevolent entity he had feared. He felt a profound sense of violation, of intruding on an ancient, unbearable grief. The previous keeper had spoken of a presence, of the sea. What if the sea had not merely taken the child, but had claimed her? The thought was a sudden, sickening plunge. He had tried to sleep, but the air in the lighthouse felt thick, an invisible shroud pressing against his skin. Every creak of the old structure, every distant sigh of the wind through the lamp room, became a deliberate sound, a watching presence. His determination, however, was a stubborn thing. The lighthouse lamp, though operational, had a specific mechanism, a complex brass cog that occasionally seized. He had found a mention of it in an old maintenance manual, a part so antiquated it would require a miracle to find. But the manual also suggested that without its eventual replacement, the entire assembly could fail. A flicker of hope, or perhaps a desperate need for a tangible task, had led him to believe he might find it in one of the small, forgotten towns nestled in the mountains a few hours inland. The drive was a stark contrast to the desolate coastal road he was accustomed to. The salt-laced air gradually thinned, replaced by the crisp, pine-scented breath of the high country. The road, initially a winding asphalt ribbon, soon narrowed into a gravel track that snaked upwards through dense forest. Reed felt a momentary, fragile sense of relief, the heavy atmosphere of the lighthouse momentarily distant. He found the town tucked into a narrow valley, a scattering of weathered buildings huddled around a single main street. It was less a town and more a collection of structures that had simply accumulated over decades. The general store was a low-slung, clapboard building, its paint peeling like sun-scorched skin. A bell above the door jangled as he entered, a thin, reedy sound that seemed to vanish into the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of sunlight piercing the gloom. The interior was a labyrinth of shelves crammed with forgotten goods, the air heavy with the scent of aged wood, dry paper, and something faintly metallic, like old coins. A man, stooped and ancient, emerged from behind a counter piled high with yellowed newspapers. His eyes, milky with age, regarded he with an unnerving stillness. Reed described the brass cog, the specific dimensions, the archaic design. The shopkeeper listened, his head cocked, then gestured with a bony finger towards a far corner. Might have something like that in the back. Never know what washes up here, even this far from the sea. He navigated the narrow aisles, his boots stirring up fine dust. He passed shelves laden with rusted tools, faded lanterns, and stacks of nautical charts brittle with age. He leaned in, peering at a box of assorted brass fittings. A sudden drop in temperature made him shiver, though the air had been still moments before. Reed. He froze, his breath catching. He spun around, but the aisle behind him was empty. The shopkeeper was nowhere in sight. He dismissed it, a trick of the old building, the wind. He resumed his search, his hands trembling slightly. As his fingers brushed against a heavy, brass-bound logbook, a small, heavy object on the shelf directly above him launched itself. It was an antique brass compass, its glass face cracked, and it didn't simply fall. It shot forward, a deliberate, forceful trajectory, narrowly missing his head as it clattered against the far wall and dropped to the floor with a dull thud. He stumbled back, his heart now hammering against his ribs. He stared at the compass, then at the empty space it had occupied. There had been no tremor, no vibration to dislodge it. He gasped, his vision blurring at the edges. The metallic scent in the air intensified, now laced with something else, something ancient and putrid, like decay from the bottom of the ocean. He tried to cry out, but his throat was constricted. Then a sound, not external, but internal, reverberating within the very bone of his skull. The pressure on his chest intensified, crushing him, forcing him to his knees. He could feel an invisible presence pressing in from all sides, a malevolent, suffocating force. It was not a hallucination. He scrambled backward, his hands scrabbling against the dusty floor, away from the corner, away from the shelves that now seemed to lean in with predatory intent. He didn't look back at the shopkeeper, who might or might not have appeared, or at the compass lying shattered on the floor. He burst out of the store, the jangling bell a mocking peal behind him, and stumbled into the crisp mountain air. The relief was instantaneous but fleeting. The entity, the presence, was not bound by the lighthouse walls. It was not confined to the coast. It was tied to him, and it had made its claim. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them twice. The lighthouse, once a lonely sanctuary, now felt like a cage he carried with him, its unseen occupant clinging to his very soul. His lungs burned, straining against the invisible constriction, his vision blurring at the edges. He fought it, a silent, desperate struggle for purchase, for air, for autonomy. His hands scrabbled, finding no purchase, only the rough, unyielding stone. This was not a hallucination, not a trick of the mind. This was real, an undeniable presence asserting its dominion. Then a new sound began to assert itself, cutting through the internal ringing. A low, mournful moan from outside, distant at first, then rapidly growing in volume and ferocity. It was the wind, but unlike anything he had heard before. It began as a sigh, deepened into a groan, and quickly escalated to a guttural roar that rattled the very foundations of the lighthouse. He stumbled to the nearest window, the thick glass already streaked with horizontal rain, whipped by gusts that seemed to tear at the very air. The sea, usually a deep, shifting canvas of gray and blue, had transformed into a churning chaos of black and white, waves rising like grotesque, hungry mountains before crashing with concussive force against the rocks below. Foam, thick and luminous, flew upwards, momentarily obscuring the distant, jagged line of the horizon. The sky was an impossible bruise, a bruised purple and violent black, shot through with flickering, unnatural light that was not lightning, but something else, something more pervasive and unsettling. The lighthouse itself groaned, a living thing under assault. Motes danced in the gloom of the interior, disturbed by the unseen stresses. A sudden, violent gust hit, shaking the structure with an almost physical blow. Then, with a crackle and a pop, the light died. REID stood in the sudden, profound black, his ears ringing with the storm's fury. He fumbled for his emergency lantern, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. He could hear water dripping, a relentless counterpoint to the wind's shriek from somewhere above. He moved quickly, checking the radio. He tried his satellite phone, the small screen remaining stubbornly blank. The signal was dead, utterly gone. The storm had not merely intensified, it had severed the lighthouse from the world. He was alone, truly alone. A new sound began to emerge from the cacophony of the storm, subtle at first, then growing. It was a rhythmic thudding, a deep, resonant knock, coming from the upper levels of the lighthouse. It was the sound of something inside, moving, asserting its presence in the newly forged isolation. As the storm raged outside, the entity's presence within the lighthouse became almost palpable. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent he couldn't quite place. Salt, damp stone, and something acrid, like ozone mixed with decay. He ascended the spiral staircase, the thudding growing louder, more insistent. Each step was a conscious effort, his muscles tensing against an unseen resistance. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that the storm was not merely coincidental. It was a catalyst, a shroud, a source of power. The isolation was not just physical. It was an act of deliberate entrapment, designed to amplify whatever malevolent force resided here. He reached the landing just below the lamp room, the thudding now directly above him. He peered up into the swirling gloom, his lantern beam cutting a narrow swathe. And there, etched onto the inner wall of the lantern room, a faint, glowing symbol he had never seen before. It pulsed with a dim, internal light, mirroring the strange flickers in the bruised sky outside. It had not been there before. His gaze drifted from the symbol, out the massive windows of the lantern room, now a blur of rain and spray. He could just make out the distant winding ribbon of the coastal road, usually visible for miles, now completely swallowed by the tempest. He knew that road snaked through the treacherous passes of the coastal mountains, the only land route connecting the lighthouse to civilization. Now even that faint line was gone, obliterated by the storm's fury, an impassable barrier of mudslides and rockfalls in his mind's eye. Escape was not just unlikely, it was impossible. Then, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, through the very glass of the lantern itself. It was not a human sound, nor an animal's. It was ancient, raw, and full of an unbridled malevolence. The glowing symbol on the wall pulsed brighter, casting a sickly green light onto the churning chaos outside. Reed felt the pressure return, not just on his chest, but against his very skull, a crushing weight that threatened to burst his eardrums. The air grew impossibly thin. The storm was its ally, its shield, its power source. It was here, tangible within the walls, ready to confront him. His determination, born of desperation, hardened. He gripped the lantern, its beam shaking in his trembling hand. It was not a physical summons to a specific place, he realized, but an imperative to perceive. The flagstones beneath him dissolved. The familiar scent of salt and damp stone vanished, replaced by a thin, frigid air that stung his nostrils. He was an observer, a consciousness adrift in a desolate landscape. Jagged, snow-dusted peaks clawed at a bruised, leaden sky. Below, a narrow, treacherous mountain pass snaked between sheer rock faces, littered with scree and sparse skeletal trees that offered no shelter. This was not the coast. This was not his lighthouse. A small, huddled group moved with agonizing slowness through the pass. Their forms were indistinct, cloaked in heavy, worn pelts and desperation. He registered the rasp of their breathing, the crunch of their boots on frozen ground, the low, guttural murmur of fear and exhaustion. At the center of the group, a woman clutched a small, bundled child. Reed felt a profound, vicarious ache in his chest. The group stopped, huddled against a sheer rock face, seeking refuge from a sudden, brutal squall of snow and ice. The woman fell to her knees, the child's whimpers growing fainter. The air thickened, not with snow, but with an almost palpable despair. He understood, with a horrifying clarity that bypassed rational thought, the nature of their plight. They were starving, desperate, fleeing an unseen horror that had already claimed much. The man raised the knife. He saw the flicker of a fire, hastily built, its flames struggling against the wind. He heard the incantation, a guttural chant in a language he did not know, yet understood perfectly. It was a plea, a bargain, a desperate offering to the desolate, uncaring earth. The flash of the blade, not against the child, but against the man's own palm, then the woman's, then the child's tiny finger. A drop of blood offered to the hungry rock. It was not malevolent in the human sense, but utterly indifferent, a hunger awakened, a pact sealed. It would grant them passage, but it would demand its due. The group, now fewer, continued their arduous journey, the presence a silent, invisible companion. They reached the coast, not far from where Reed's lighthouse now stood. They were broken, haunted, but they had survived. The man, the one who had offered the blood, was driven by a frantic need to fulfill the pact, to find a permanent anchor for the entity that had saved them. He saw the construction of the lighthouse, not as a beacon of hope, but as a cage, a vessel, a monument to a terrible promise. The entity, born of desperation and sustained by a primal need for an anchor, found its purpose in the structure, its existence intrinsically linked to the light that would be tended within. He saw them, a procession of faces etched with weariness and a growing madness. Each subsequent keeper, chosen from the descendants of the original group, inherited the burden. They were not driven mad by solitude or ghosts. They were consumed. Their sanity, their vitality, their very essence slowly bled into the lighthouse, nourishing the entity, strengthening its hold. The lighthouse was a living, breathing maw, and the keepers were its sustenance. The grim fate of his predecessors was laid bare. Not death by accident or despair, but a slow, internal dissolution. Their purpose was to burn, to shine, to keep the entity satiated and tethered, preventing the return of the ancient hunger that had first manifested in the mountain pass. The fear was not that the entity would escape, but that it would starve, and in its starvation, unleash something far older, far more terrible. Something that had driven those desperate souls from the mountains to the sea. The ritual, the means of appeasement, was not complex, but horrific. It was not about defeat, but about maintenance. The light must be tended, yes, but it was the keeper's sacrifice, their slow, deliberate surrender of self, that truly sustained the entity. The lamp itself was merely a focal point, a conduit for the life force. To break the cycle, to truly end the entity's hold, required an act of ultimate refusal. The price for this defiance, the vision implied, would be absolute. He gasped, lungs burning, the taste of salt on his tongue. He was still pinned, but the unseen weight now felt different, less a threat and more an extension of the entity, a tendril of its ancient hunger. He understood its origin, its purpose, the nature of the tragedy that bound it to this place, and the grim fate that awaited him. The come was no longer just a command. It was an invitation to his own slow consumption. But now he knew the rules of the game. He saw the path to defiance, however perilous. It was a beckoning to oblivion, a surrender he refused. With a guttural cry, more animal than human, he thrashed, a desperate, frantic surge of defiance. The invisible grip momentarily faltered, a fleeting weakness he seized. He rolled, gasping, scrambling away from the spot, his fingers blindly raking against the rough stone. His hand found the logbook, still clutched where he'd dropped it. Its leather cover, damp with sea spray and his own sweat, felt like an anchor in the swirling chaos of his mind. He pulled it close, his vision still swimming, the lighthouse lamp above casting errant, dizzying arcs of light through the storm-lashed glass. He flipped through the worn leaves, his thumbs smudging the faded ink. The scrawl of the former keeper, a meticulous descent into madness, now seemed a beacon. His eyes landed on a page marked by a crudely drawn symbol, a jagged circle enclosing a series of overlapping lines. Beneath it, a block of text, denser and more frantic than the rest, detailed a binding. To cut the tether when the sea is roused to its fury, and the sky weeps fire. REID deciphered the archaic language, his mind racing, piecing together the grim instructions. It wasn't a banishment in the traditional sense, but an attempt to sever the entity's connection to the lighthouse itself, to weaken its hold, to make it leave. The method was crude, almost pagan, a mix of personal sacrifice, specific elements of the land, and a symbolic offering. It required a piece of the keeper's own blood, a handful of sand from the lowest tide, a fragment of iron from the tower's base, and crucially, a specific type of stone, described only as the heart of the pass, to be found at the highest, most exposed point of the coastal ridge, the mountain pass. He knew the place. It wasn't a pass in the true sense, but a treacherous, windswept saddle in the rocky promontory that rose sharply behind the lighthouse, forming a narrow, desolate path to the mainland. Locals avoided it even on calm days, speaking of strange echoes and a pervasive sense of wrongness. In a storm like this, it would be a death trap. But the logbook was explicit. The binding had to be performed. There, at the height of the tempest, when the boundary between worlds was thinnest. He moved with a frantic, desperate energy, ignoring the tremors that racked his limbs. He fumbled in his pocket for the small utility knife he rarely used, its blade glinting dully in the dim light. A quick, shallow cut across his palm, a sharp sting, then the warm, metallic trickle against his skin. He caught a few drops in a small, empty shell he found on a nearby shelf, its inner surface pearlescent and cool. He wrestled open the heavy oak door leading outside, the wind instantly tearing at him. A physical blow. Rain lashed his face, tasting of salt and grit. The roar of the ocean was deafening, a hungry, limitless sound. The iron was easier, a rusted nail, ancient and corroded, pried from a loose floorboard in the lower chamber. The heart of the pass remained. He pulled a thick oilskin coat over his clothes, the fabric stiff and smelling faintly of mildew. The logbook was tucked securely inside, its instructions burned into his memory. He grabbed an old lantern, its glass grimy, and lit the wick, the fragile flame dancing wildly. The wind howled through the cracks, a mournful, predatory sound. Stepping out into the full force of the storm was like walking into a solid wall of water and noise. The lighthouse, usually a sturdy sentinel, swayed perceptibly. The path to the pass was treacherous, a narrow ribbon of loose scree and exposed rock that climbed steeply. The entity's presence intensified with every step away from the relative safety of the lighthouse. He heard the faint, distant echo of a shriek, not from the wind, but from something deeper, something within, the storm itself. He slipped, scraping his knee, the pain a sharp, grounding sensation amidst the rising panic. He clutched at the rock face, his fingers numb. The pass loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the storm-racked sky, the highest point of the ridge, battered by the full, unbridled fury of the elements. It felt like the very throat of the storm, a place where the air thinned and the world seemed to hold its breath. He pressed on, each step an act of sheer, desperate will, fueled by the terrifying certainty that if he failed, he would not merely die, but be consumed. REID stood amidst the scattered remnants of his desperate preparations. The air in the small antechamber reeked of brine and something else, something metallic and burnt, a smell that clung to the damp stone. He had finished the mix: powdered obsidian, sea salt harvested from the deepest rock pools, the fine ash of ancient driftwood, and a lock of his own hair, all ground together with a stone pestle until it was a gritty, dull paste. The archaic script, now seared into his memory, had detailed each component, each gesture, each guttural incantation. He clutched the heavy, iron-bound bowl containing the mixture, its surface cool against his palm. The ascent beckoned, the winding spiral of the lighthouse stairs, each step a further commitment to the precipice of his sanity. The iron steps groaned under his weight, a discordant symphony accompanying the rising wind outside. Each revolution brought him closer to the lantern room, to the heart of the lighthouse, and to the entity that had twisted his solitude into a waking nightmare. He remembered, briefly, a different climb, years ago, up a desolate mountain pass, the thin air biting, the sheer drop to his left, a constant dizzying threat. He had felt exposed, vulnerable then, but at least the threat had been visible, tangible rock and wind. The danger here was formless, insidious, clinging to the very fabric of the structure around him. He pushed open the heavy trapdoor leading into the lantern room. The glass panes, usually a beacon of light, were opaque with salt spray and the encroaching gloom. The space was vast, circular, and utterly desolate. No light shone, only the pale, bruised twilight filtering through the grime-streaked glass. The wind howled through unseen cracks, a mournful, hungry sound. And then, he saw it. It was a distortion, a swirling vortex of deep, bruised color that seemed to absorb the scant light rather than reflect it. He perceived movement within it, a grotesque mimicry of limbs, tendrils that writhed and snaked, not quite solid, not quite gas. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to originate from inside his own skull, vibrating against the delicate structures of his inner ear. The smell intensified, a sickening blend of decay, ozone, and something uniquely acrid, like burnt bone. He forced himself forward, his boots scraping on the grit-covered floor. He reached the central pedestal where the lamp should have been, now merely a vacant circle of pitted iron. With a deep, shuddering breath, he began. He scooped the paste from the bowl, its gritty texture rough against his fingers, and smeared it in a precise circle around the base of the pedestal, following the ancient symbols etched into his memory. He saw flashes, the crumpled metal of a car, the vacant stare of a loved one, the endless crushing weight of guilt. The visions were sharp, immediate, designed to paralyze him, to make him drop the paste and succumb. His hands shook, the paste threatening to spill. He closed his eyes, squeezing them shut against the onslaught, and pushed through the mental torment. "Hear me," he rasped, his voice raw, barely audible above the entity's scream. "You are bound no longer. This place rejects you." The entity retaliated. The glass panes of the lantern room groaned, cracks spiderwebbing across them with sharp, cracking reports. The entire lighthouse shuddered, a deep, grinding tremor that threatened to throw REID off his feet. He felt a pressure on his chest, as if an invisible weight was pressing him down, stealing his breath. It was trying to break him, to make him abandon the ritual. He finished the circle, then began drawing the intricate sigils within it, each stroke a deliberate act of defiance. He could feel its intent, a pure, unadulterated hatred that clawed at the edges of his mind. He continued the chant, his voice growing stronger, fueled by a desperate primal will to survive. The entity froze, its distorted form shimmering, then began to recede. Not with a roar or a violent expulsion, the cracks in the glass had stopped, frozen in their intricate patterns. The shuddering of the lighthouse eased, replaced by a low, mournful groan from the old structure. He stood, trembling, bathed in a sweat that felt like ice. He descended the spiral staircase slowly, each step a testament to his exhaustion. The lower levels of the lighthouse were in disarray. Overturned furniture, scattered papers, and a fine dust of plaster coated everything. The storm, or perhaps the entity's final outburst, had taken its toll. He didn't bother to survey the damage properly. His only thought was escape. He stumbled out into the pre-dawn gloom, the sea a restless, churning mass under a bruised sky. It felt like a cage, emptied of its immediate tormentor, but still holding the echo of its presence. He walked to his vehicle, the keys heavy in his numb fingers. He drove, not looking back. The coastal road was deserted, winding away from the sea, away from the towering, accusing finger of the lighthouse. He pushed the speedometer higher, the tires humming a desperate song of escape on the asphalt. He would find a new life, somewhere far from salt spray and ancient, hungry stones. He imagined clean, bright rooms, the mundane sounds of a city, the comforting anonymity of crowds. The sun climbed, painting the eastern sky in pale oranges and purples. The landscape slowly shifted from desolate coastline to rolling hills, then to the steeper inclines of the interior. He reached the foothills of the mountain range, the air growing crisp and thin. The road narrowed, twisting upwards through dense stands of pine, the scent of resin sharp and clean. He felt a fragile sense of peace settling over him, a numb detachment from the horrors he had endured. The entity was a nightmare, a memory he would slowly, carefully bury. He drove through a winding mountain pass, the road carved precariously into the rock face. On one side, a sheer drop into a forested valley, on the other, a towering wall of granite. He pulled over at a small, isolated overlook, needing to stretch his legs to breathe the clean, unburdened air. The view was breathtaking. A vast panorama of peaks and valleys, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic confines of the lighthouse. The wind here was different, a high, keening moan that whistled through the jagged peaks, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He felt a profound lightness, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders, from his very soul. It wasn't a sound, not precisely, but an absence of sound, a peculiar attenuation of the wind's howl. The air around him seemed to thicken, to hum with an almost imperceptible vibration. He opened his eyes, scanning the distant tree line, the granite cliffs. The feeling persisted, a faint pressure at the back of his skull, a prickle on his skin. He shivered, despite the sunlight. He ran a hand through his hair, then paused. His fingers brushed against something. He pulled his hand away, his gaze dropping to his palm. There, clinging to his skin, was a single, minute shard of glass. It was perfectly clear, almost invisible, but glinted faintly in the sun. It was unmistakably from the lantern room, a fragment of the shattered panes. He must have picked it up unknowingly during his escape. He stared at it, a tiny, innocuous speck. He felt a tremor run through him, not of fear, but of recognition. The fragment wasn't just glass. It was a link, a piece of the lighthouse, a piece of the entity clinging to him. The entity hadn't been defeated. It had merely found a new vessel, a new way to endure. He looked at his reflection in the vehicle's window. A faint, almost imperceptible sheen, like salt spray, seemed to cling to his skin. He felt a vast, unsettling emptiness within himself, a space that had been carved out and then filled with something else. It was radiating from him. He was the lighthouse now, and the horror, he understood with a dawning, terrible clarity, had only just begun.